For 27 years, the businessman didn't let anyone enter the office, until the cleaning lady did, and Margaret Wilson never questioned the rules of the house where she'd worked for 15 years, especially the most important one: never enter the second-floor office. That Tuesday morning, she held the master key with trembling hands, knowing she was about to break the only prohibition businessman Richard Taylor had established since her first day on the job. It all began when her employer collapsed in the living room, clutching his chest and screaming for his heart medication. The ambulance rushed Richard away, but before losing consciousness, he grabbed Margaret's arm with desperate strength. "The medicine. Office drawer. Second drawer on the right," were his last words before the paramedics took him. Margaret stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the key she'd always seen hanging in the kitchen, but never dared touch. In 15 years working at that mansion in the Upper East Side of New York City, she'd cleaned every corner, every piece of furniture, every vase, except that mysterious room that remained locked like a closely guarded secret. Her heart pounded as she climbed the marble stairs. Each step seemed to echo through the empty house, as if the building itself knew something was about to change forever. The dark wooden door loomed before her, imposing and intimidating, with a golden lock that gleamed even in the dim hallway light. When she turned the key, the metallic click sounded like a gunshot. Margaret took a deep breath and slowly pushed the door open. The smell that hit her was a mix of old paper and a familiar perfume she couldn't quite place, one that made her stomach twist strangely. Morning sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, creating golden beams that illuminated a scene which left her completely frozen. The office wasn't just a workspace, it was a shrine. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, all showing the same woman at different ages and in different situations. Margaret approached trembling, her legs nearly giving way when she realized she was looking at herself. These were photos of her from the past 15 years, taken secretly during her work, during trips to the market, during her rare moments off in the park. Some were from impossible angles, as if someone had hidden to document every moment of her life. But that wasn't all. Among recent photos were much older ones, yellowed with time, showing a young Margaret beside a man she took several seconds to recognize as Richard, decades younger. They were embracing, smiling, clearly in love. The problem was Margaret was absolutely certain she'd never met Richard before being hired to work in his home. A sharp pain shot through her head, the kind that had plagued her for years, especially when she tried remembering certain periods of her youth. Her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the old photographs. How could there be records of moments she couldn't remember? The office was filled with disturbing details. A mahogany desk stood at the center, covered with meticulously organized papers. There were closed notebooks, sealed envelopes, and an open planner showing notes about her work schedule from recent months. Every entry was detailed. Margaret arrived at 7:15 a.m., seemed tired. Margaret sang while cleaning the library. Margaret smiled when she saw the garden flowers. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers tremendously. Now, continuing. It was as if Richard was constantly observing her, documenting every gesture, every expression, every breath. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine when she found an entire file dedicated to her eating habits, her music preferences, even the books she borrowed from the neighborhood public library. But where was the medicine? Margaret forced herself to focus on the original mission, even as her mind spun in 1,000 different directions. The second drawer to the right of the desk was locked, but there was a small golden key taped beneath the wooden surface. When she opened it, she found not only the bottle of heart medication, but also a yellowed envelope with her name written in elegant handwriting. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a letter dated 25 years earlier, written by Margaret herself, but in handwriting she didn't recognize as her own. The words made her stagger. My beloved Richard, if you're reading this, it means something has gone wrong with me. I know your family will never accept our love, but I want you to know these were the happiest months of my life. The baby I'm carrying will grow up knowing they were conceived in the purest love that ever existed. If I don't make it back, please find me. Please don't forget me. Forever yours, Margaret. The world spun around her. Baby? What baby? Margaret had never had children, at least not that she remembered. But then why was there a letter written by her talking about a pregnancy? And why couldn't she recall writing those words or living that love that seemed so intense? With shaky legs, she kept searching the drawer and found medical documents with her name, reports of severe head trauma, records of retrograde amnesia, prescriptions for seizure medication. The dates on all the documents matched exactly with a hazy period of her life when she had woken up in a county hospital with no memory of how she'd gotten there. At the time, the doctors said she'd been in a car accident, but the details had always been vague. Margaret only remembered waking up in a hospital bed, alone, with no family, no friends, no past. A social worker helped her get new documents and a small government stipend. Her life had practically started over at that moment, but these papers told a different story. They showed that someone had paid all her medical expenses, that someone had ensured she received the best possible treatment, that someone had stayed by her side throughout her recovery, and that someone was Richard Taylor. Margaret sank into the leather chair behind the desk, feeling her legs wouldn't hold her up any longer. On the desk's surface was a framed photo she hadn't noticed before. It was her, visibly pregnant, standing beside Richard in a garden that looked familiar. Both of them were radiant, their hands intertwined over her rounded belly. How was it possible she didn't remember any of this? How does someone simply forget being pregnant? Margaret instinctively touched her abdomen, searching for scars or marks that might confirm this impossible reality. A noise downstairs made her freeze. Firm footsteps climbed the stairs, accompanied by a woman's voice speaking on the phone. Margaret recognized it immediately. It was Elizabeth, Richard's daughter, who rarely visited the house. From the tone of her voice, she seemed agitated, probably coming straight from the hospital. Margaret tried to quickly put the documents back in the drawer, but her hands were shaking so badly she dropped several papers on the floor. The footsteps grew closer. There was no time to hide the evidence that she'd violated Richard's forbidden sanctuary. "I knew you'd come in here eventually," said Elizabeth from the doorway, making Margaret jump in surprise. Richard's daughter was around 40, with brown hair pulled into a flawless bun and expensive clothes that betrayed her social standing. But there was something in her eyes Margaret had never noticed before, a mix of sadness and anger that seemed to have built up over decades. "I can explain," Margaret began, rising from the chair. "Your father wasn't feeling well and asked me to get his medicine here." "I know why you're here," Elizabeth interrupted, closing the door behind her. "And I know who you are. I've always known." Richard's daughter's tone was icy, but there was something deeper beneath it, an old pain seeping through the practiced coldness. Margaret felt her stomach tighten as Elizabeth approached the desk and picked up the photograph of the pregnant woman. "This is you, Margaret. 25 years ago, pregnant with my brother." The words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. "Brother? What brother?" Richard had never mentioned having any other children besides Elizabeth. "I don't understand," Margaret whispered, bracing herself against the desk to keep from falling. "What brother? I don't remember any of this." "Of course you don't," Elizabeth replied bitterly. "My family made sure of that." Margaret felt another sharp pain in her head, stronger this time. Fragmented images flickered in her mind like flashes from a broken camera. A room with floral wallpaper, masculine hands caressing her belly, a violent argument in an elegant room, the sound of tires screeching on wet pavement. "What did you do to me?" Margaret's voice came out more like a moan than a question. Elizabeth sat in the leather armchair near the window, as if preparing for a long, painful conversation. "My father fell in love with you when he was 25. You worked as a clerk in a clothing store downtown. He went there every week just to see you, until one day he finally worked up the courage to ask you out for coffee." Elizabeth's words echoed strangely in Margaret's mind, familiar yet distant, like a song heard in a dream. "You dated in secret for 2 years. My father wanted to marry you, but my grandparents would never allow it. A shop clerk marrying the Taylor heir. Unthinkable to them." Margaret vaguely remembered working in downtown stores when she was young, but the memories were like faded photographs, devoid of detail or emotion. When you got pregnant, Dad made a decision. He said he would marry you even if it meant losing his inheritance, but my grandparents had other plans. Elizabeth paused, watching Margaret's confused, desperate expression. They hired people to intimidate you, told you they'd make your life hell if you didn't disappear, offered money, threatened your family, did everything to tear you apart. What happened? Margaret asked, though part of her already feared the answer. You ran away. One night you just packed your things and vanished. Dad was frantic, hired private investigators, scoured the whole city looking for you. That's when the accident happened. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, gazing at the garden below as if reliving painful memories. You were driving in the rain, trying to reach a bus station. The car skidded and hit a pole. The impact was terrible. The doctors said you almost didn't make it. Tears burned in Margaret's eyes without her fully understanding why. It was as if her body remembered the pain, even if her mind couldn't access the memories. And the baby? The question came out as a whisper. My brother was born prematurely, but he was fine. You were in a coma for 3 weeks. When she woke up, she couldn't remember anything from the past 2 years. The doctors said the amnesia might be temporary, but it never came back, Margaret finished. Dad wanted to take care of you, wanted you to meet your son, but my grandparents stepped in again. They said it was the perfect opportunity to solve the problem once and for all. You were transferred to a county hospital, all your documents were changed, and my brother was given up for adoption. The revelation hit Margaret like an avalanche. Everything made sense now. The constant headaches, the feeling that something important was missing from her life, the strange familiarity she'd always felt working in that house. Why did he bring me here to work? Margaret asked, wiping away tears she couldn't control. Because he could never forget you. He spent years searching for you. When he finally found you, you were living alone in a tiny rented room, cleaning houses to survive. You didn't remember him, didn't remember anything. Elizabeth sat back down, and Margaret noticed she was emotional too, struggling to keep her composure. He made up an excuse to hire you as a cleaner, said he wanted to help you discreetly, keep you close, hoped that one day your memory might return. This office became the place where he kept everything about the two of you, all the memories you'd lost. Margaret looked around the office with new eyes. It wasn't a shrine to obsession, but to desperate love. Every photograph, every document, every object stored there represented an attempt to preserve something that had been brutally destroyed. And you knew about all this from the beginning? Margaret asked. I found out little by little. At first I thought he'd hired you out of pity. Only later did I understand who you really were. And to be honest, I hated you. Elizabeth's blunt confession made Margaret take a step back. Why did you hate me? Because my mother was never loved by him. Dad married her out of obligation after you disappeared. She knew she was just a replacement, that his heart belonged to a ghost. My entire childhood was marked by her sadness, by his emotional absence. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, back to the story. Margaret felt an immense weight in her chest. Not only had she lost her memory and her son, but she'd also been indirectly responsible for an entire family's unhappiness. But over time I realized you were a victim too, Elizabeth continued, her voice softer. You lost as much as all of us, maybe even more. A heavy silence settled between them. Margaret sat back down in Richard's chair, trying to process the flood of information. 25 years of her life had been built on a lie, on an emptiness she'd never been able to fill. What happened to my son? The words came out haltingly, as if she were testing a foreign language. Dad never stopped looking for him, spent fortunes hiring private investigators, lawyers specializing in adoption. For years he found nothing. The adoption process had been completely sealed. Elizabeth opened a small drawer in the desk and pulled out a blue folder Margaret hadn't noticed before. Then, 5 years ago, he finally got a lead. Margaret held the folder with trembling hands. Inside were legal documents, photographs, and newspaper clippings, all about a young man named Michael Taylor Reynolds, 24 years old, with a degree in civil engineering from Columbia University. The photographs showed a tall, dark-haired young man with deep-set eyes, a strange but familiar blend of Margaret and Richard's features. In one of the most recent photos, he was standing next to a young blonde woman, both smiling, with captions indicating it was his college graduation. He was adopted by a middle-class family in Queens, Elizabeth explained. He grew up loved, attended good schools, became a good man. Dad has been keeping tabs on him for years, but never had the courage to reach out. Why? Because Michael has a good life, a family who loves him. Dad was afraid showing up out of nowhere and telling the truth might destroy his stability, and also because you weren't there. Margaret understood. Richard wanted her to be present when they met their son. He wanted it to be a full family reunion, not just the painful story of a father who abandoned his child. But now things have changed, Elizabeth said, looking directly into Margaret's eyes. You know the truth. Your memory may not have fully returned, but now you know who you are, you know what you lost. Margaret flipped through the pages of the dossier on Michael, absorbing every detail of the life of the son she didn't remember bringing into the world. There were school reports, photos from sports competitions, newspaper articles about engineering projects he had developed. Richard had meticulously documented every aspect of Michael's life, like a father watching from afar. He's handsome, Margaret murmured, tracing one of the photographs with her fingertips. He looks like his father. And like you too, Elizabeth replied with a half smile. Especially the way he tilts his head when he's thinking. Margaret tried to remember carrying that baby, feeling his first movements, dreaming about his future. But it all remained blank, like a movie where someone had erased the most important scenes. A phone rang, making them both jump. Elizabeth answered quickly. It's the county hospital, she said, covering the receiver with her hand. Dad's waking up and asking for you. Margaret felt her heart race. How could she face Richard now, knowing all this? How would he react when he found out his secret had been revealed? I don't know if I can, Margaret admitted. It's too much to process. He needs you, Elizabeth said, putting the phone away. And maybe the two of you need to talk. There's so much only he can tell you. Margaret stood slowly, picking up the medicine bottle that had sparked this entire discovery. The small object seemed insignificant compared to the magnitude of what she had learned. Elizabeth, she said before they left the office, do you forgive me for ruining your family's life? Richard's daughter paused at the door and turned. For a moment, her face softened completely. Margaret, you were just as much a victim as we were. My grandparents destroyed everyone's lives with their choices. You're not to blame for anything that happened. They walked down the stairs in silence. Margaret felt as if she were moving through a dream, each step taking her deeper into a reality she still couldn't fully accept. In the car on the way to the hospital, Elizabeth shared more details. How Richard had faked heart problems in recent years, consulting different doctors to always have medicine on hand, hoping one day Margaret would need to enter the office. How he'd spent entire nights writing her letters he never had the courage to send. How he kept every little thing she forgot at the house. An earring, a pen, a handkerchief, as if they were priceless treasures. He never gave up on you, Elizabeth concluded as they parked at the hospital. Even knowing you didn't remember him, even knowing that to you he was just your boss. Margaret felt a strange mix of gratitude and sorrow. It was comforting to know she had been loved so deeply, but devastating to realize she had lost 25 years of her own life. The county hospital buzzed with the typical afternoon bustle. Margaret followed Elizabeth through the white corridors, breathing in the familiar scent of disinfectant that always made her anxious. When they reached the room, she hesitated at the door. Richard was awake, sitting up in bed, looking frailer than she had ever seen him. When he spotted her in the doorway, his eyes lit up in a way she had never noticed before, but which now made perfect sense. "Margaret," he said, his voice so full of relief and emotion that she nearly started crying again. "I brought your medicine," she said, holding up the bottle. Richard smiled in a way she couldn't quite read. There was sadness there, but also something like hope. "You went into the office." It wasn't a question. "I did. And now you know." Margaret moved slowly toward the bed. Elizabeth lingered by the door as if sensing this moment needed to belong to just the two of them. Why didn't you ever tell me? Margaret asked, sitting in the chair beside the bed. Because I was afraid, Richard admitted. Afraid you'd run. Afraid you'd think I was some obsessed madman. You seemed happy, or at least at peace, with your simple life. I didn't want to cause you more pain. But I had the right to know. You did, he agreed. And I know I was selfish. But having you near, even if you didn't remember me, was better than not having you at all. Margaret looked down at his hands, weathered by age but still strong. She tried to imagine those same hands cradling her pregnant belly 25 years ago. I want to meet Michael, she said suddenly. Richard closed his eyes as if he'd waited decades to hear those words. Are you sure? He knows nothing about us. To him, we're just strangers. But we're his parents, Margaret replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. And even if I don't remember carrying him, even if my mind doesn't hold those memories, something inside me knows he exists. Richard opened his eyes and looked at her with such intensity that it made her flush. You've always been brave, he said softly. Even without the memories, your essence is still the same. Tell me what I was like, Margaret asked. Tell me about us. Richard took her hand gently, as if it were made of glass. You were the most determined person I'd ever met. Worked 6 days a week at the shop, studied at night to finish high school, and still found time to care for your sick mother. Margaret felt a familiar twinge in her head. She vaguely remembered an elderly woman, but the memory was blurry, lacking detail. Your mother passed away a few months before the accident, Richard continued. You were completely alone in the world. Maybe that's why you had the courage to run when my parents threatened you. You had nothing left to lose. And you, didn't you fight for me? I tried. His voice cracked slightly. But I was young and completely dependent on my parents. When you disappeared, they practically kept me under house arrest while they hired detectives to find you. When I heard about the accident, I nearly lost my mind. Margaret instinctively squeezed his hand. I came to the hospital every day while you were in a coma. My parents thought I was at the office, but I spent afternoons sitting by your side, waiting for you to wake up. And when I did, you looked at me like you'd never seen me before. The doctors said it was normal, that your memory might come back gradually. But my parents took advantage of your confusion and had you transferred to another hospital. By the time I realized, you were gone again. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. It was devastating to imagine the despair of a young man in love losing everything in a matter of days. It took me 2 years to find you again, Richard continued. You were living in a horrible boarding house, barely able to pay rent. You were too thin, clearly not eating well. That's when I made up the story about the cleaning job. And all these years you watched me, hoping I'd remember. At first, yes. But as time passed, I realized it might be better this way. You seemed to be adjusting well, had a routine, seemed stable. I was afraid revealing the truth might unsettle you again. Margaret stood up and walked to the bedroom window. Below, ordinary people lived their normal lives, unaware that upstairs, a woman was discovering the last 25 years of her existence had been built on a lie. Richard, she said without turning, do you think I could love you again? Even without the old memories? The question took them both by surprise. Margaret hadn't planned to ask it, but the words came out naturally. I never stopped loving you, he answered softly. Not for a single day. She turned and looked at him. Richard at 60 was different from the young man in the photographs, but there was something in his eyes that moved her strangely, as if some primal part of her recognized that gaze. I need time, she said. I need to process all this. I need to understand who I really am. Take all the time you need, Richard replied. I waited 25 years. I can wait another 25 if I have to. Elizabeth chose that moment to enter the room. Sorry to interrupt, but I just got an interesting call, she said, looking puzzled. It was from Michael. Margaret and Richard exchanged glances, and she could see the same nervousness she felt reflected in his eyes. What did he want? Richard asked. He's doing genealogical research on his biological family. Said he hired a specialized company and they found some leads. He wants to meet us. Margaret sank heavily into a chair. It was as if the universe was conspiring to bring all their secrets to light at once. Did he say anything else? She asked. He said he always wondered about his real parents, but only now had the courage to look. His adoptive family was always open about it, but he never wanted to hurt them by digging into the past. And what changed? Richard asked. He's going to be a father. His girlfriend is pregnant. He said he now feels a responsibility to his family history. Margaret was overwhelmed. She was going to be a grandmother to a child she didn't know, the child of a son she didn't remember having. Elizabeth, she said slowly, did you tell him anything? I said I needed to talk to you first. We set up a meeting for tomorrow. Margaret looked at Richard, searching his eyes for guidance on how to handle this impossible situation. What do you think we should do? Richard asked. I think we should tell him the truth, Margaret answered, surprising herself again with the determination in her voice. He's looking for us. We owe it to him to show ourselves. And if he doesn't take it well? Elizabeth asked. It's a lot to process at once. Then we'll give him the time he needs, Margaret said, just like you're giving me. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps those of us just starting out. Now continuing, Richard smiled and Margaret realized it was the first time in years she'd seen him truly happy. In that case, he said, I think it's time we leave this county hospital and prepare for a meeting we've been waiting 25 years for. The next morning, Margaret woke up in her small studio apartment with the strange sensation of having slept deeply for the first time in years. The constant headaches that had plagued her for as long as she could remember had completely vanished, as if uncovering the truth about her past had healed an old wound she hadn't even known existed. She had arranged to meet Richard and Elizabeth at the office before the conversation with Michael. When she arrived at the mansion, the house felt different, as if the secrets weighing on those walls had finally been set free. Richard was waiting for her in the living room, visibly nervous. He had swapped his formal hospital clothes for a simple shirt and jeans, which made him look younger and more approachable. How are you feeling? He asked as she entered. Different, Margaret answered honestly. Like I'm meeting myself for the first time. They walked up to the office together, which was no longer a forbidden sanctuary, but a living archive of their interrupted lives. Margaret studied the photographs on the wall with fresh eyes, searching for any flicker of memory hidden in her mind. Richard, she said, stopping in front of a photo where she appeared laughing, her hair blowing in the wind, do you think I was happy? You were the happiest person I ever knew, he replied without hesitation. You found joy in the simplest things, a song on the radio, a dog on the street, a funny story someone told. Margaret touched the glass of the frame, desperately wishing she could remember being that radiant young woman. And after I lost my memory, do you think I was happy working here? Richard fell silent for a moment, clearly weighing his answer. You seemed at peace, he finally said, but I always sensed a sadness behind your eyes, as if some part of you knew something important was missing. Margaret nodded. She had always felt exactly that, an inexplicable melancholy that followed her like a shadow. Elizabeth appeared at the office door. Michael just called, she announced. He's on his way. He'll be here in an hour. Margaret's stomach tightened with nerves. How does one prepare to meet the son she forgot she had? And how are we going to explain all this? She asked. With the truth, Richard replied. He deserves to know exactly what happened. But what if he's angry? What if he blames you for abandoning him? Then we'll have to face that anger, Elizabeth said pragmatically. But at least he'll know it wasn't for lack of love. Margaret spent the next hour trying to organize her thoughts. How do you explain to a 24-year-old that his birth parents were torn apart by a wealthy, cruel family? How do you tell him his mother lost her memory and completely forgot his existence? When the doorbell rang, Margaret felt as if her legs might give out. Richard held her hand firmly. Let's go together, he said. They walked down the stairs slowly, as if stepping toward destiny itself. Elizabeth opened the door, and Margaret found herself face to face with a young man who was the perfect blend of her and Richard. Michael was tall like his father, but had her dark eyes and the shape of her face. There was an unsettling familiarity in his gestures, the way he tilted his head as he greeted them, just as Elizabeth had mentioned. You must be the Taylor family, he said, extending his hand. His voice was deep and gentle. "Michael," Richard said, and Margaret could hear him fighting to control his emotions. "Thank you for coming." They sat in the living room, an awkward silence hanging between them. Michael seemed genuinely interested, but also a bit confused about why a wealthy family was willing to help him with his genealogical research. "So," he began, pulling a notebook from his backpack, "the genealogy company said you had information about my birth parents. I know it might seem strange after all these years, but now that I'm about to become a father myself, I feel like I need to know my history." Margaret exchanged a glance with Richard. There were so many wrong ways to start this conversation. "Michael," Richard said carefully, "first and foremost, we want you to know your questions are completely valid and understandable." "Thank you," Michael replied. "I've always wondered about them. My adoptive parents are wonderful. They never hid anything from me. But there are some questions only birth parents can answer." "What kind of questions?" Margaret asked gently. "Well, medical ones mostly. Family history, genetic predispositions, that sort of thing. But also," he hesitated, "I've always wanted to know if I was wanted, if they loved me, even if they couldn't raise me." Margaret felt tears burning in her eyes. The most important question he had was exactly the one she most wanted to answer. "Michael," she said, leaning slightly toward him, "you were the most wanted, most loved baby that ever existed." He looked at her with a strange expression, as if he'd noticed something in the intensity of her response. "Did you know them?" he asked. "We are them," Richard said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked from Richard to Margaret, then to Elizabeth, as if trying to process impossible information. What?" he managed to say finally. "I'm your father," Richard continued firmly. "And this is Margaret, your mother." Michael stood abruptly, nearly knocking his notebook to the floor. "This can't be right," he said, pacing nervously around the room. You're wealthy. Why would you give me up for adoption if you could have raised me?" "Because we didn't have a choice," Margaret replied, standing as well. "Michael, we were torn apart by force, and I lost my memory in an accident. For 25 years, I didn't even remember you existed." Michael stopped pacing and stared at her. "What do you mean you lost your memory?" And so they told him everything. Richard recounted the forbidden romance, the secret pregnancy, the threats from the wealthy family. Margaret explained the accident and the complete amnesia. Elizabeth filled in the details about the years of searching, the secret office, the love that was never forgotten. Michael listened in silence, sometimes shaking his head in disbelief, sometimes asking specific questions about dates and details. When they finished, he sat quietly for several long minutes. "So you're telling me," he said finally, "that my whole life my father was watching me from afar, and my mother didn't even know I existed?" "That's exactly it," Richard confirmed. "And you never tried to find me officially?" "I did," Richard admitted. "But by the time I finally got information about you, you already had a family who loved you. I didn't want to destroy your happiness." Michael sat down again, running his hands through his hair in a gesture identical to the one Margaret made when stressed. "This is a lot to process," he said. "We understand," Margaret said softly. "Take all the time you need." "What if I don't want a relationship with you?" Michael asked bluntly. The question stung, but Margaret admired his honesty. "Then we'll respect your decision," Richard replied. "But we hope you'll at least know you were always loved, even when we couldn't show it." Michael remained silent again, observing each of them as if trying to find physical or behavioral similarities. "Can I ask a few questions?" he finally said. "As many as you like," Margaret replied. "First, medical questions. Any family history of illnesses?" Richard and Margaret spent the next hour answering all the practical questions Michael had prepared. Medical history, hereditary traits, information about grandparents and great-grandparents. It was a surreal conversation, as if they were filling in 24 years of gaps in just a few hours. "Now for a more personal question," Michael said, looking directly at Margaret. "How do you feel knowing you have a son you don't remember carrying?" Margaret took a deep breath, striving for absolute honesty in her answer. "It's devastating and wonderful at the same time," she said. "Devastating because I missed all the important moments of your life. I don't remember feeling you move inside me. I don't remember dreaming about your future. I don't even remember the day you were born." Michael listened intently. "But it's wonderful, because now I know why I always felt like something important was missing in my life. It was you. It was the certainty that somewhere in the world there was a part of me I didn't know." "And you?" Michael turned to Richard. "How do you feel, having watched me grow up from afar?" "Proud," Richard answered without hesitation. "Immensely proud of the man you've become, and also regretful that I didn't have the courage to reach out sooner." Michael nodded slowly. "I need some time to process all this," he said. "But I'd like to learn more about you, about our story." Margaret felt a wave of relief and hope. "That would be wonderful," she said. "But I have a few conditions," Michael continued. "First, I want my adoptive parents included in all of this. They're my real family, and any relationship we develop needs to respect them." "Of course," Richard agreed immediately. "Second, I want to take this slowly. We can't just pretend we're a normal family after 24 years apart." "We understand completely," Margaret said. "And third," Michael hesitated, "I want you to meet my girlfriend, Jennifer. If we're going to try to build some kind of relationship, she needs to be part of it." "We'd love to meet her," Elizabeth said, speaking for the first time in a while. Michael stood up, clearly still processing everything he'd learned. "I'm going to leave now," he said. "I need to talk to Jennifer and my parents, but can you give me a few days to digest all this?" "Take all the time you need," Margaret replied. At the door, Michael turned one last time. "One final question," he said. "If you could go back in time and change everything that happened, would you?" Margaret and Richard exchanged glances, both understanding the weight of the question. "No," Margaret answered surprisingly, "because if we change the past, you might not be exactly who you are today, and who you are is perfect." Michael smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "Okay," he said. "I'll call in a few days." After he left, the three of them sat silently in the living room, each absorbing what had just happened. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Margaret asked. "We did the only thing we could," Richard replied. "We told the truth." "And now?" Elizabeth wondered. "Now we wait," Margaret said, "and hope that love is stronger than lost time." 3 days later, Michael called. His voice sounded calmer, more resolved. "I've talked to everyone," he said. "My adoptive parents want to meet you. Jennifer is curious about the whole story. And I think I want to try." Margaret felt tears of relief stream down her face. "What are you proposing?" Richard asked. "A dinner, informal, at my parents' house, so everyone can get to know each other without pressure." "That would be perfect," Margaret replied. "There's one more thing," Michael said, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Jennifer is 4 months along. If things go well between us, you'll be grandparents." Margaret had to sit down. The thought of being a grandmother to a child who would grow up knowing their complete family history was almost too overwhelming to bear. The dinner was set for the following week. Margaret spent the days in between, swinging between anxiety and anticipation. She bought a new dress, something she hadn't done in years, and for the first time in decades, she genuinely cared about her appearance. Richard was equally nervous. They had spent the last few nights talking in the office that was once off-limits, her gradually getting used to the idea that she had been loved so deeply, him finally able to speak openly about the feelings he'd kept hidden for so many years. Michael's adoptive parents' house was in a middle-class neighborhood in Queens. It was a simple but cozy home, with a well-kept garden and a barbecue area in the back. When they rang the doorbell, Margaret felt her heart might explode. The door was opened by a woman in her 50s with graying hair and a warm smile. "You must be Margaret and Richard," she said. "I'm Susan, Michael's mother. Please come in." The house was filled with photographs of Michael at every age. Margaret saw his childhood documented on the walls, his first steps, graduations, sports competitions. all the moments she had missed. "I know this must be hard for you," Susan said gently, noticing how Margaret studied the photos, seeing everything you missed. "Actually, it's comforting," Margaret replied honestly, seeing how loved and happy he was. Susan's husband, Robert, was a kind man who worked as a mechanic. He greeted Richard with a firm handshake and a genuine smile. "Michael told us everything," he said. "What an incredible story. You must be on an emotional roller coaster." "That's one way to put it," Richard answered with a half smile. Michael appeared in the living room with a young, blonde, pregnant woman who could only be Jennifer. He seemed more relaxed than the last time, as if he had found some kind of inner peace about the whole situation. "Margaret, Richard," he said, "this is Jennifer." Michael's girlfriend was a delicate woman with expressive blue eyes and a shy smile. She approached Margaret carefully. "It's strange to meet someone who's going to be my baby's grandmother," she said honestly. "But Michael told me everything, and I think you've been through terrible things." "And you?" Margaret asked. "How do you feel about all this?" "Confused but hopeful," Jennifer admitted. "Michael always wondered about his birth family. Now that we know the truth, maybe he can finally feel whole." Dinner was prepared by everyone together, an oddly natural experience given the circumstances. Margaret helped Susan in the kitchen, while Richard and Robert talked about cars and football. Michael and Jennifer moved between the two groups, clearly trying to ease the interactions. During the meal, conversation flowed surprisingly easily. Susan and Robert were simple, welcoming people, without any resentment or jealousy toward Michael's birth parents. If anything, they seemed genuinely interested in bringing the two families together. "You know," Robert said to Richard, "Michael was always a boy who wondered about his roots. Sometimes he'd ask if his birth parents loved him, if they ever thought about him. We always answered that we were sure of it, but we never imagined it was literally true." "He was always loved," Richard responded, "every single day of his life. And now you can tell him that in person," Susan added. Margaret watched Michael all evening, looking for signs of how he was handling the situation. He seemed to be making an effort to reconcile the two realities, the family that raised him and the family that brought him into the world. After dinner, while the others chatted in the living room, Michael asked to speak with Margaret and Richard on the porch. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Grateful," Margaret answered. "Your adoptive parents are wonderful people." "They are," Michael agreed. "And I want you to know that nothing that happens between us will change that. They'll always be my parents." "And we would never question that," Richard assured him. "But," Michael continued, "I also want to get to know you. I want to understand where I come from. I want my son to know his full story." Margaret felt a deep emotion hearing him say, "my son." She was going to be a grandmother. She was getting a second chance to be part of a child's life in the family. "Michael," she said, "I know I can't get back the lost years, but if you'll let me, I'd love to be part of my grandson's life. And I'd like to be the grandfather I never got to be for you," Richard added. Michael was silent for a moment, looking at the garden lit by the porch light. "I think we can try," he finally said, slowly, respecting everyone involved, "but yes, I think we can build something together." Margaret felt her heart might burst with joy. 25 years after losing her memory and her family, she was getting a second chance to be a mother and to become a grandmother. In the months that followed, the blending of the families was gradual but steady. Margaret and Richard started attending Sunday dinners at Susan and Robert's home. Michael and Jennifer visited the mansion regularly, especially after Richard converted the secret study into a nursery. Margaret began recovering fragments of memories, little flashes that surfaced at unexpected moments. Richard's laughter sometimes triggered familiar echoes. The smell of certain foods brought vague sensations of long-ago happiness. The doctor explained this was normal. Severe trauma could suppress memories for decades, but safe environments and positive emotions sometimes allowed fragments to resurface. The relationship between Margaret and Richard also evolved slowly. They didn't try to recreate the romance of the past, but allowed a new kind of affection to grow between them. It was different from the passionate love of their youth, more mature, more careful, but just as deep. When their grandson was born, a boy named Ethan, Margaret finally understood what had been missing in her life all those years. Holding the baby in her arms, she felt a visceral connection that transcended memory. It was as if some primal part of her recognized this little being as family. Richard, watching Margaret with their grandson, realized it had been worth waiting 25 years for that moment. 3 generations finally reunited. 3 lives that had been brutally torn apart by circumstance now bound together again by love. Michael turned out to be a wonderful father and a devoted son. He divided his time equally between his 2 families, always making sure no one felt left out. Jennifer grew very close to Margaret, especially after learning her mother-in-law had gone through similar experiences of loss and rebuilding. Elizabeth, who had initially felt threatened by the family reunion, gradually found her place as an aunt and sister-in-law. She developed a special bond with Ethan, often joking that she finally had a nephew to spoil. The most profound transformation happened with Margaret. After decades of living as a woman without a past, she finally had a complete story. There were still gaps in her memory. There probably always would be. But now she knew who she was, where she came from, and why she had always felt incomplete. She continued working at the mansion, but now by choice, not necessity. Richard had insisted on ensuring her financial security, but Margaret preferred to maintain her independence. Housework had become almost meditative for her, a way to care for the home that was now truly a family home. 5 years after the reunion, the family had established their own traditions. Christmases at the mansion with everyone present. Birthdays always celebrated together. Sundays at Susan and Robert's house, where Ethan played in the garden while 3 generations of adults talked about everything and nothing. Margaret, now with graying hair and wrinkles around her eyes, was whole for the first time in decades. She had learned to live with the lost memories, focusing on the present and the future she could still build. Richard, now 70, seemed rejuvenated. The love he had guarded for so many years finally had a destination, a tangible expression. He and Margaret never officially married, but they lived as companions, each maintaining their independence while sharing daily life. Michael grew both professionally and personally, becoming a respected engineer and a devoted father. The completeness of his family story gave him a confidence that reflected in every aspect of his life. He often said that meeting his birth parents had given him not just answers, but also a model of how true love could overcome any obstacle. Ethan, now 5 years old, was growing up surrounded by love and stories. He knew he had 2 special grandmothers, Grandma Susan and Grandma Margaret, and that his family had a very special story of people who had been lost and found each other again. One Sunday afternoon, as she watched Ethan play in the mansion's garden, Margaret reflected on the impossible journey that had brought her to this moment. 25 years of lost life, but a second chance at happiness that few ever got. "What are you thinking about?" Richard asked, sitting beside her on the garden bench. "About how strange life is," Margaret replied. "I spent so much time trying to remember the past that I almost missed the chance to build a future. And now? Now I know some things are more important than memories," she said, watching Michael push Ethan on the swing. "Some things are stronger than time, deeper than remembrance." Richard followed her gaze to their son and grandson playing together. "Love," he said. "Love," she agreed. That night, after everyone had left, Margaret went up to the old secret office, now converted into a guest room for when Ethan stayed over. The walls still held some of the old photographs, but they were now joined by new ones. 3 generations smiling together, moments of happiness consciously and carefully built. She picked up one of the old photos, where she appeared young and pregnant beside Richard. For a moment, she tried to remember that day, that radiant happiness captured on her face. Nothing came, as always, but for the first time, it didn't sadden her. The young woman in that photo had lived her happiness fully, even if Margaret couldn't remember it. And the Margaret of today was building her own happiness, just as real, just as precious. She placed the photo back on the shelf and smiled. Some love stories are so powerful, they survive even being forgotten. Some families are so destined to be together that they find their way back no matter how impossible it seems. And sometimes, second chances are even sweeter than the first, because they're built with the wisdom that only comes after loss, time, and the understanding that true love is indeed stronger than anything. The end of the story. Now tell me what you thought of this touching story about the power of true love and the reunions fate sometimes brings. Do you believe Margaret and Richard deserved this second chance? How did you feel when you discovered the whole truth about her past alongside Margaret? Share your honest thoughts in the comments. We love reading every single one. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss other heartfelt stories like this one.